Hello. Welcome to Locked On Sharks, the premier hockey podcast of your favorite team in the Bay Area. And on today's episode, we ask, are the Sharks stuck in the creamy middle? I'm going to be looking at teams' life cycles and how this affects their decision making, and what happens when you get stuck in the creamy middle, as the Sharks currently are. So what is the creamy middle? So we're going to discuss all that and more as we continue our path towards the draft and look at decisions that teams make and how they make those decisions based on where they're at in their life cycle. Let's get at it.
You're Locked On Sharks, your daily podcast on the San Jose Sharks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
My name is JD Young, the host of Locked On Sharks, also contributor to San Jose Hockey Now, and as of today, contributor to Fear the Fin. I want to thank you guys for making us your first listen. Of course, we are free and available wherever you get podcasts, and you can check us out on YouTube as well. We're going to be discussing life cycles today and what that actually means for teams and how that it affects their decision making. And every team in the NHL or just in sports in general can be kind of put into these buckets of life cycles, because if you're a team contending for a title, you're going to make decisions that are differently than if you're a rebuilding team. So when, we've all been part of this, me, myself too, where it's like, hey, the Sharks should just trade, Erik Karlsson to whoever. Like, it doesn't work that way. Every team wants to feel like that they won the trade or that they're getting something out of the trade, and that affects their decision making. So I feel like today was a good day to kind of take a step back as, we get closer to the draft, and the Sharks are probably going to be big players at the draft with potentially moving up Brent Burns or potentially moving Erik Karlsson, trying to free up some cap space. But you have to take a step back and look at why teams do this, and if they're going to make a trade, does it actually fit into their timeline, right? If you're a rebuilding team like a Montreal or Arizona or Buffalo, one of those type of teams, you're not going to make the same decisions as a Tampa Bay or, Florida Panthers or, or Colorado Avalanche. And I think it's good to kind of step back, look at where teams kind of fit in their life cycle and what actually is a life cycle for a team, right? So the way I've kind of bucketed is there's 5 different life cycles. You have your Stanley Cup contenders or your championship contenders, but we're going to stick to hockey for this since we are a hockey podcast. But you have your Stanley Cup contenders. These are your cream of the crop teams, right? These are your teams that are trying to think that they can win the cup this year. You have your playoff contenders. These are kind of your next tier. You have the creamy middle. You have your young cores that are kind of looking to take the next step. And then you have your rebuilding teams. So let's start at the top, right? Your Stanley Cup contending teams. These are your, like I said, these are your Colorados, your Carolina Hurricanes, your Lightnings. They have built their team so that they can try to win the Stanley Cup right now. They have the right combination of either star power, depth, whatever, your je ne sais quoi that kind of makes up the team, right? Their focus is on how can they make their team better right now to win the cup. And, going into the draft, like, they don't really care about the draft as much. They're going to draft players and they're going to look, they want to restock their pipeline and stuff. But to them, drafting a guy who's in, an 18-year-old who's in Moose Jaw or wherever, like, he's not helping them win the cup right now. So these are, this is kind of your pinnacle, right? You've worked hard, you've built up, through drafting or trading or signing players, you've built up to this point. And when you get to the draft, hopefully you'll have a nice shiny ring to show off for it. But, the draft is kind of secondary into your team building right now, because you're not a player you draft now isn't going to help you win the Stanley Cup in the next 5 years. So these guys, the draft picks aren't as valuable to them. They're willing to trade them away to try to get someone who can help them as soon as possible. Again, that you've earned that right as a Stanley Cup contender to be able to, say whatever to the future and, mock drafts and all that stuff. They don't care about that. Next, these are your playoff contenders, right? These are kind of the next tier below. These teams are like your Minnesota Wild, your Dallas Stars, your Washington Capitals, teams that are either kind of working their way up, like the Wild, or they're kind of maybe taking a step back from being a Stanley Cup contender, like your Washington Capitals. So they're going to be in the mix for the playoffs every year. They are looking at, maybe how do you take that next step from going from a playoff contender to a Stanley Cup contender? They're trying to add those pieces, and for them, they're going to be, they're with their draft picks and the way they kind of handle their business is, those draft picks, again, how can they help improve their team right now? And they're still going to be drafting because these are usually guys who are in the late 20, mid to late 20s when it comes to the draft, and you can still find a lot of value there. But again, they're not making the bold decisions I think that the Stanley Cup teams are. They're still kind of looking 1 to 2 years out of how can we take our team from a playoff contender where we're going to be competing every year to get the playoffs, like the Minnesota Wild, right? Very good team, but they just lack that one thing to kind of put them over the edge. And this year they tried to trade for Marc-Andre Fleury. Didn't quite work out for them. They were able to let go of a Kaapo Kähkönen because Kaapo Kähkönen isn't helping them win the Stanley Cup, or kind of making the push to win the Stanley Cup this year. So, so again, they're still going to hold on to their draft picks. They're still trying to look a year or two out in the future, maybe help build up that prospect pipeline where they can take those picks, those players, and then trade them for something else to try to help them when they're ready to make pushed into a Stanley Cup contender. Before we get into the creamy middle and where the Sharks lie and what that means for them, let's go ahead and take a quick break and talk to you guys about our friends over at rockauto.com. Guys, you're trying to buy parts for your vehicle and it's such a hassle. You go to the store, you're like, hey, I need a muffler for my car. And they're like, what type of car do you have? What type of trim does it have? What type of engine? And like, I don't know, man. It gets me from point A to point B. And then you go and they punch in the computer and they go behind the counter and they only have one version of that part and you're stuck paying for that. So why worry about the hassle when you have rockauto.com literally in your pocket? Pull out your phone, go to rockauto.com. You can save time and money when using Rock Auto. So why choose to spend up to 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or dealership when you can go to rockauto.com? Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Although Kyle has left, we are still pro 100% doing it yourself. They have reliably low prices for every customer. They've got everything you need from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpets. So head over to their website today. Let them know that we sent you by typing in locked on in their How Did You Hear About Us box. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, the creamy middle. This is where the Sharks lie right now. They are a team that is too good to be bad and too bad to be good. The Sharks were, for a long time, the Sharks were either in the playoff contender or Stanley Cup contender, and they just unfortunately never were able to finish the job. And this is what happens naturally to every team, where you kind of go through the cycle of, we were really good for, how many years, but now what happens? Now the Sharks are kind of left with that aging core. They have too many long contracts. They're too, the people that they're counting on are starting to get through their peak and to the tail end, kind of the tail end of their careers. And what did the Sharks do? So, they've the way the Sharks have been, they've committed themselves where they're going to try to kind of hold on to this core as long as they can. They re-signed Tomas Hertl. They re-signed Alexander Barabanov. At the trade deadline, they didn't try to move any big pieces. There's still talks at the draft where it seems like one of these big contracts has to be out the door by the time we get to free agency for the Sharks to be able to do anything. And it seems like we're trending that way. But again, with these teams that are kind of stuck in the creamy middle, they don't really have a direction, right? The Sharks have admitted they want to try to make the playoffs, and that's their prerogative of trying to make the playoffs. But how I'm hesitant on how they can make that process. And, I'm going to spend some of the summer trying to get back to the playoffs and what the process and direction is. But they're just kind of stuck in this middle right now where, again, they're too good to be bad, as we see with their 11th pick where, they had too many, like Timo Meier was their best player last year, and James Reimer really helped solidify the goaltending. And Tomas Hertl's in the dead center of his peak right now. This is we're prime Tomas Hertl years, and Brent Burns still is a good contributor, and we saw Logan Couture is not the same guy he used to be, but he can still be an effective player. Erik Karlsson, when he's healthy and on the ice and engaged, he can still be an otherworldly talent. But it's the consistency or just the availability with Erik Karlsson. And, so they're too good to get one of these prime draft picks, your Shane Wrights, your, Slavkovskys, your Coolies, et cetera, that help kind of make the decision easy for the Sharks to kind of push into a rebuilding type of thing. But there are still too many holes, and there's just not enough depth and quality players for them to be in that playoff contending, Stanley Cup contending. I mean, we saw when the Sharks played, like the Avalanche is watching, if you haven't been watching the playoffs, but it's like watching two different sports. The Avalanche, they're just so much speed and so much talent, from top to bottom, or the Lightning where you have just such peak talent, or the goaltending, where it's just the Sharks, they might be able to compete with these guys like on a single night, but through a 7-game series, there's just, the Sharks just don't have the depth, don't have the high quality stars for these guys to be able to, to be a playoff contender or be a Stanley Cup contender. So yeah, it's tough. Too good to be bad, too bad to be good. So that kind of brings us to our next group. So these are your young, kind of fun teams that are ready to kind of make that next push. So these guys are coming out of their rebuilding process. I would look at teams like the Anaheim Ducks. The Kings are kind of leaving. They've kind of just left this process. But so like your Anaheim Ducks, your New Jersey Devils, I would even say the Ottawa Senators. They've been bad for a long time, and they feel like they have their core together, right? They've been drafting high. They've been kind of cleaning their books, kind of getting resetting type of thing, and they're ready to take that next step. So like the Ducks, they have Zegras and they have Drysdale, and then they're going to have another high draft pick this year. Like they're adding these kind of young pieces, but at some point you have to kind of go from just being rebuilding to to kind of competing. And we saw like the Kings last year where they've been rebuilding for a while. They've added a lot of really quality pieces. They found their potential superstar in Quentin Byfield, and they feel like they were ready to take the next step. And they did. They made the playoffs last year, but signing Philip Deneau in the offseason is that kind of move where you're like, okay, we've completed our rebuild, and we're going to take a quality guy who, maybe a little bit older than the rest of our core, but he can help us win right now. And you look at a team, like the Devils, who have a bunch of really good quality forwards. Last year they signed Dougie Hamilton, and this year there's talks of them potentially trading the second overall pick to try to help get them that next superstar, next star player who can help take them from out of their rebuild into that next phase with them. And I know the Devils need some goaltending help and stuff, but they're ready to take that next step from being a rebuild young team into how do we move into that playoff team phase. And I think that's where those teams are. And the Sharks they don't have, I know the Sharks played a lot of rookies last season, but those guys aren't core players, right? Merkley is a potential core player, but he's still, as we talked about yesterday's show, where he's kind of behind on his development, especially compared to his peers in his own draft class. And then you look at, like, who else on the Sharks can you be, like, the young players can you look at and be like, oh yeah, that's a core player. William Eklund, who's going to be playing this year. Then you have the 2020 draft class who's going to, but again, those guys haven't made the NHL, and those guys haven't proven that they're going to be considered core players yet. So, the Sharks there, and whoever they add with the 11th pick, if it's your Korchinski or Lambert or Nazar, whoever, again, those guys aren't playing next year. They're still in their development phase. So, yeah, the Sharks haven't moved from that creamy middle to, okay, we have a bunch of young, fun core player guys to kind of move on to. So, and finally, the last phase, the rebuilders. A phase where I think a lot of Sharks fans would be okay with if the Sharks were actually here right now, because at least it feels like you have a direction. So these are your teams that are decided we're going to tear it down, go to to the studs. We're trading off our kind of our players who aren't going to be helping us on our timeline, right? These are your Canadians, your Buffalo Sabres, your Kraken, your Coyotes. We all know who the rebuilders are. And they're in the asset collection phase. They're for them, the draft picks and acquiring young players who can help kind of be your next core. That is what they're doing right now. Look at the Coyotes. So last year they decided, okay, whatever we have, they've been kind of in that creamy middle where it's like we might make the playoffs, we might not make the playoffs, but we're not winning a cup at this rate. So they decided to just tear it down. They traded off anything that they wasn't bolted down. They traded off and tried to get assets back. They traded the Sharks Adin Hill for a second round pick because they didn't think Adin Hill was going to be part of their timeline. He was too advanced in too far along on their timeline to kind of. So by the time by the time the team was good, he's probably going to be past his prime or heading down. So just what didn't fit their timeline. The Buffalo Sabres, they traded Jack Eichel. They've been picking high for the past couple of years, and they're still in that kind of asset collection phase where we want to try to get as many draft picks as possible, try to take a swing on young players, et cetera, et cetera. The Montreal Canadiens, you can see they went from, they were literally in the Stanley Cup to picking first overall in less than a season. So, the window closed fast. But, with these teams, they're willing to take on your bad contracts as long as they get the assets back and getting that, getting those draft picks. Those are the most valuable things to them, is getting either draft picks or getting prospects who can fit their new timeline. So what does this all mean? So you have to think about every team, if you're in a different bucket, right? If you're a rebuilding, or if you're in the creamy middle, or if you're a playoff contender, Stanley Cup contender, you're going to approach your decision making differently. So when teams are like, hey, we should just trade, Brent Burns to whoever, you have to think about from the other team's perspective. Why would they do that, right? I mean, yes, the Sharks would like to do that because they want to get off Brent Burns' contract, right? But does it make sense for that other team? Does that move help them in their timeline and what they're trying to do? So it's, again, should the Sharks trade Timo Meier to the Devils? Is a fun one that we've seen recently for the around the second, with the second overall pick. Does that? Yes, that fits the Devils timeline, right? They have a young core, but they're trying to add that next superstar piece. And that makes sense for the Devils, but with the way the Sharks have gone about their business, it doesn't make sense for the Sharks. Why would they trade their best player last season if they have said we are not going to rebuild? We're trying to contend try to make the playoffs. We believe in our core, et cetera, et cetera. It just doesn't make sense from the Sharks' standpoint of trading away a young player. I mean, Timo Meier's 25. He's entering his prime right now. I know you got to pay him. That's a whole thing. And if Timo Meier just comes in and says, I'm not going to play here anymore, then that's a different discussion. But the Sharks have made it clear through their actions of re-signing Tomas Hertl, not trading James Reimer, re-signing Alexander Barabanov. They want to compete for the playoffs. And cool, having Slafkovsky or Cooley, that'd be really fun, but are those guys helping the Sharks make the playoffs next year? No. Again, the Sharks should trade Vlasic to, the Canadiens. The Canadiens would be very happy to get that asset back. I mean, I know they don't have the cap space, but two, you're going to have to attach a major asset for the Canadiens to take that on. And again, Vlasic he's already said, this is where I want to play. I'm not waiving my no trade clause, et cetera, et cetera. Brent Burns, like we said, he's opened that door of potentially wanting to trade somewhere to go win a cup. I don't think the Sharks are winning a cup in the next 3 years while his contract is still, while he still has a contract. But he holds all the leverage. He has a 3-team no trade clause. So if he's like, I don't want to go to, I only want to go to, I'm just saying, the Lightning or the Panthers or the Stars or whatever, he holds all the leverage. And those teams, again, for them, does Brent Burns help them win a cup right now? The Sharks, again, would probably love to get off of Brent Burns' contract and try to acquire not only an asset, but just the cap space to be able to do something else. Again, does it make sense for both teams involved? And that's the big thing. With the Sharks being kind of stuck in that creamy middle of not knowing, hey, I want to, again, we want to try to win the cup, or we want to try to make the playoffs. You make the playoffs, we've seen in the playoffs, weird stuff happens, right? But just keep that in mind when we see these fake trades or news, of what's going to happen with these teams, or what are the Sharks, trying to do. They made it very clear they want to free up some cap space. They want to take that cap space and they want to try to add players who can help move them out of that creamy middle to a playoff contender, because they feel like that they are still have the core. It's aging core, but they still feel like they have the pieces to try to maybe make a playoff run. And they're going to still value their draft picks, because at the same time, we believe in Doug Wilson Jr. and his ability to draft. William Eklund, that 2020 draft class between Coe and Robbins and Ozzie and Gushin, one of those guys is going to pop, right? So, and whoever they pick with the 11th pick, that guy, he's not going to help him this year, but he's going to add to that new core as the Sharks try to run the gauntlet, or not run the gauntlet, but try to thread the needle of going from an aging core to a young, fun core at some point, with the help of your own older veterans to kind of help lead the way into the next phase. So that's going to do it for me today. We'll be back tomorrow with a draft profile. We're going to be doing one Cutter Gauthier. And yeah, so make sure if you guys are enjoying the solo show, you can, of course, find me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Locked On Sharks, or at least find the show there. You can listen wherever you get podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Odyssey, the whole 9 yards. You guys all know. YouTube, go ahead. And if you haven't, please subscribe. The goal is to try to get to 1,000 before the draft. If you subscribe, you'll get to see my little Lego of the day. Today was Luke Skywalker's Red 5 helmet. I try to switch it up every episode. So yeah, please go ahead and subscribe. Really, like I said, really helps the show. And if you haven't, go ahead. If you're on app, especially if you're on Apple, leave that 5-star review. Helps the master algorithm to get the show out there to new people. So you can find me on Twitter at myfryhole. And again, thank you guys for making us your first Sharks listen. Go check out the Locked On NHL podcast as the playoffs continue to roll on. And go check out my article, which is about the same topic over at Fear of the Fin. And we'll be back tomorrow with a draft profile. Bye, friends.